Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lecture 3 in Dr. Tom's installments of the American Civil War lecture series. So today we're focusing on beyond the 1830s, going to the 1840s and part of the 1850s. Now, sectionalism, that is something that was born around 1820, really, as far as when it became a huge issue in regards to the Missouri Compromise. So by the time we get to 1845, keep in mind it's been 60 years or so since the American War of Independence. And so you have to remember that the spirit of the revolution has largely died off as far as it's being a source of real national pride. It's not to say they weren't still proud of having won that war and secured their independence, but Americans no longer typically saw the British as their main enemy at this point. If you're in the North, your biggest enemy was people in the South. And if you're in the South, your biggest enemy were people in the North, particularly politicians on both sides. And this sectionalism between the two regions did lead to direct hatred. And this generation, by the time we get to around 1845, 1850, the politicians in Congress were born into sectionalism. They are the children of the generation that saw the Missouri Compromise. And therefore, this generation is more angry, more aggressive than we've seen in previous generations. Okay, so I'd now like to move on to Frederick Douglass, who is a very interesting character in American history. In previous lectures, we referred to William Lloyd Garrison, who had gone from being a gradual abolitionist to an immediate abolitionist by the time he got to 1831 and began publishing a newspaper called The Liberator in Boston. Frederick Douglass also launched a literary campaign against slavery. And the two books I'd like to highlight are The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, and My Bondage and My Freedom, published 10 years later in 1855. These two books are both autobiographical, are both excellent sources, primary sources, in fact, of the causes of the American Civil War and indeed also on the issue of American slavery. Now, I want to point out that Frederick Douglass is very different from William Lloyd Garrison. In the first instance, he is an ex-slave. So born into slavery, he purchased his own freedom. And when he started working with William Lloyd Garrison, they were very close friends. However, the two of them grew apart, and they had some real differences between them. For starters, William Lloyd Garrison believed that the Constitution of the United States did protect slavery. And he believed, therefore, that the Constitution needed to be scrapped. Frederick Douglass, on the other hand, believed that the Constitution of the United States went against slavery, and therefore did not need to be changed, and therefore the issue of abolition could and should be adopted by politicians, Northern politicians, who would take the cause of liberating slaves to the fore of American politics. That's what Douglass advocated, and that is going to be his major impact on the slavery debate. Another principal difference is with methodology. William Lloyd Garrison was a pacifist. He was very much a committed pacifist. Frederick Douglass was, while not openly pro-violence, did think that it could come to the point where violence might need to be used in order to combat slavery in the United States. So those two broke on that issue as well. Douglass eventually started publishing also a newspaper called the North Star, called that reference to, of course, the star that guided the three wise men, the three kings, to the barn in Bethlehem where Jesus Christ was around Christmas time. And therefore, this reference means a guiding light, a star that will guide runaway slaves to the north. Okay, so that's 1847. Now I want to move on. What is important to understand is that in spite of the fact that the abolitionist movement continued to grow in momentum in the 1830s, 1840s, and beyond, we have to keep in mind that there was also a growing and louder pro-slavery movement going on, and not just in the South. And I want to start by talking about John Hopkins, who is the man on the top left. He was a bishop in the Episcopal Church. He is, in fact, the bishop for the state of Vermont. Now, keep in mind, Vermont is a northern state. In fact, it's in New England. New England is where abolitionist movement is at its absolute strongest. So a little bit of a surprise, but it shows that not everyone in New England was anti-slavery. And so Reverend Hopkins preached from the pulpit that blacks were better off in slavery than they would be in a situation where they are free. So there you go. So even in New England, you have some pro-slavery advocates. Now I want to talk about James Burney, who's on the top right, and also Elijah Lovejoy on the bottom left. Both of them are newspaper journalists. Both of them create their own abolitionist newspapers. Now let's start by talking about James Burney, the one on the top right. Now he was actually born in Kentucky, which of course is a slave state. He moved to Alabama, and whilst in Alabama, he ended up becoming a slave owner himself. But he ended up having a major awakening and became an abolitionist. Now with that in mind, he then moved to the north. Obviously, it's a bit safer for him there. Problem is, he moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati is just across the Ohio River from Kentucky, a slave state. So when he set up his printing press there, he thought that he was safe from the mob. Not so. One night, the mob crossed the river from Kentucky, and they attacked Burney, and they destroyed his printing press. So Elijah Lovejoy, the bottom left, similar situation, but even worse. Now Lovejoy was a native New Englander, so he'd been an abolitionist for his whole life, and he had a newspaper called the Alton Observer, which he actually created in Illinois, which again is in what was the Northwest back then, which was not nearly as anti-slavery as New England, and also brings you closer to slave states such as Missouri and Kentucky. So a bit dangerous of a location to create an anti-slavery, an abolitionist newspaper. But that is what he did. And the Alton Observer ended up being attacked. His printing press again was wrecked. Now Lovejoy was murdered. And this happened in 1837. So this is a year after Burney's printing press was attacked in Ohio. But Lovejoy was killed. And one thing that really shocked a lot of people, North and South, was we have a situation where we had a white man who was killed owing to the institution of slavery. A white man killed by a group of white men over the institution of slavery. We'd not had that before. So this is a turn of events, and some people wondered if it was a foreshadow of what's to come. Well, yes, we'll get to more of that later. Now, I also want to point out the fact that Lovejoy's, the men who attacked Lovejoy were put on trial, but they were all found not guilty. So even there, you can see the anti-abolitionist sentiment within the state of Illinois at that time. So I also want to talk about one more person, that is Prudence Crandall, who is on the bottom right. Now, Prudence Crandall was a Quaker. Quakers, of course, have always been anti-slavery. They are the first anti-slavery advocates in the United States, the first abolitionists, if you will. So they tend to be viewed as quite radical. Now, she was in Connecticut, which is New England, which is where the abolitionist movement is at its absolute strongest, as I've just mentioned. And in Connecticut, Crandall opened a school, and it was a school exclusively for black girls to get an education. Well, that school got very heavily vandalized by local whites, And not only was the school building itself attacked, but on top of that, so was the school's well. The local whites poisoned it. So again, Connecticut, a New England state, and New England is where abolitionism is at its strongest. But you can see that that is not universal in New England. Meanwhile, if you go out to the Northwest, or Midwest as it's now called today, you can imagine that the anti-abolitionist sentiments will be stronger. But something else we need to remind ourselves of is the fact that don't think that all abolitionists are in favor of blacks having equal rights in society at that time. That was far from the case. All abolitionists, of course, are against the institution of slavery. However, that does not mean they think that blacks should have the right to vote. That doesn't necessarily mean that. It doesn't necessarily mean they think that blacks should have the right to an education. And there's a lot of abolitionists who don't like the idea of slaves being freed in the South and then moving up to the North. There's a lot of abolitionists who do think that slaves, upon being set free, should be deported. So there is some division within the abolitionist movement as far as, okay, what's the next step after they're set free? And that is where a lot of people in the North started expressing anger towards blacks who were settling up there after fleeing slavery in the South. Okay, and right here you can see the Elijah Lovejoy Memorial, and that is in Alton, Illinois today, and that is near the spot where he was killed. Now I want to bring up John C. Calhoun again. Now you'll remember from our previous lecture that John C. Calhoun was Vice President of the United States who had resigned in protest against the tariffs imposed by the federal government that the southern states particularly did not like, particularly South Carolina. And so John C. Calhoun, in defense of his state, resigned from the vice presidency of the United States. And South Carolinians very quickly after elected him to the United States Senate as one of their 2 representatives in that chamber. And it was in February of 1837, Calhoun takes the lead in the pro-slavery debate in the Senate. And it was that February when he gave a speech where he referred to slavery as being a positive good. And what is significant about that is the fact that Calhoun referred to the slaves getting free food, free shelter, free clothing, and all this is provided for them. Now, take that apart bit by bit. Well, what sort of clothes are they wearing? They're wearing rags. A lot of them don't even have shoes. The food they're eating is minimal, and it's up to the masters what they eat and how much they eat. Then there's also, of course, the shelter, living in wooden cabins that were barely more than shacks. Some of them had wooden floors. Those which did not have wooden floors, which were elevated by lumber above the ground, did have wooden flooring, but they had gaps so wide between the boards and some of them that mice, rats, snakes, everything could get right up in there. And they were not nice places to live. Now, Calhoun did go further to point to how workers, who you could argue were wage slaves in industrial areas of Europe and also in the American North, were living in conditions which were as bad, just colder. And there is some truth to that. But the fact is, those people in the American North, in Europe, had the option of leaving whatever job they had if they wanted to and going on to another profession. Slaves didn't have that choice. So in a lot of ways, this is a very lousy comparison. But it is significant to point out that the South is starting to use what we call the paternalistic argument to defend slavery. Now, we got to the point where you'll remember when we had the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that the 3630 parallel, the Missouri Compromise line, didn't go very far west where it bumped into Mexican territory. And so there are some issues here where the South is starting to dream, it would be nice to take a lot of this land from Mexico. We can perhaps extend the Missouri Compromise line west, perhaps all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and then areas south of it could be open to slavery, and then we'll get more pro-slavery senators into the Capitol building in Washington, and we'll have increased representation. And in the minds of Southerners, that is going to help preserve the institution of slavery for the long term. Now, we are going to have a war with Mexico, 1846. Now, this war is going to be a very big cause of the American Civil War, to say the least. What happened right before it is very significant. That's the fact that Texas, which had been part of Mexico, declared independence of Mexico in 1835, and they fought for it in 1836. They did eventually win that war against Mexico, but when that war was over, there remained a debate between the newly created Republic of Texas and also the government of Mexico as far as where exactly Texas was, more specifically where it stopped. Now, if you look at that map, you will see everything that is in yellow, dark yellow. That is areas that Mexico was willing to recognize as Texas. The bits which are striped yellow and green are bits that Texas also claimed was theirs, but Mexico said, no, that's not part of Texas, that's still part of Mexico. Now, where things are going to get more interesting is Texas joins the United States in 1845. Or as Texans like to say it, the United States joined Texas in 1845. I think the U.S. narrative is probably more accurate. Okay, so with that in mind, the United States also wants clarity as far as where that border with Mexico is. And so according to the Mexican government, the southwestern border of Texas was marked by the Nueces River. Texas was actually backed by the United States government, said, no, 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 the border is further southwest to the Rio Grande. Now, if that's the case, that means all that disputed territory that is striped with yellow and green, then that would also be territory of the United States. Not just Texas, but the United States. Oh, Southerners love this argument going on. So they decided that this might be that opportunity to go to war with Mexico and perhaps snatch some land from them, land which could be future slave states. So now the area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande on that map, might look quite small, but you need to know that the gap between them is actually 100 miles wide. So we're talking about quite a lot of land, quite a lot of land. And then there's also the bit northwest going up all up there. So we've got a lot to figure out here. And we have a new president here, President James K. Polk. All right, Polk was born in North Carolina. Then he moved out to Tennessee. And he is very much pro-annexation, bringing in Texas to the Union. And he also is in favor of this idea that perhaps we can take advantage of the situation with this dispute, this land dispute about where that border of Texas is, to take even more land from Mexico. And what he had in mind was some provinces that were under the Mexican flag, principally a western province called California, and also an area that we present day refer to as New Mexico, Arizona, which back then the United States preferred to call the New Mexico Territory. So Polk is looking for a war with Mexico, and what he's stating publicly is he wants this because he wants to establish that the Rio Grande is the border of Mexico and Texas, not the Nueces River. But privately, Polk's got this extra strategy here that we're also going to take California and we're going to take the New Mexico Territory as well. So what he did was, you can't just create a war. You have to find a reason to send the troops in. But with that in mind, he decided to go ahead and mobilize the United States Army, and he sent them down to Texas and basically said, just stay there and we're going to wait for an excuse to invade them. So there's no question that we're going to go in there. The question is not if we attack Mexico, it's when we attack Mexico. The United States war with Mexico was won very quickly. And so as a result, uh, the United States did manage to secure the Texas border all the way to the Rio Grande, and they also managed to take the territory of California and New Mexico. Now, that is a result of the United States winning the war, because when you win the war, you determine the terms of the peace after the war is over. And that's exactly what the United States did. So they insisted on taking that territory from Mexico, and they offered them $15 million for it. That is today's equivalent of about $614 million. That sounds like a lot of money, but considering it's all of California, it's all of New Mexico, it's all of Nevada, it's a huge chunk of present-day Colorado, parts of Wyoming, Utah, etc. This is a ripoff. It's an absolute ripoff. And it's basically an example of the United States taking advantage of having complete control over the terms of the peace. So Mexico didn't really have any choice but to sell all that land to the United States for dirt cheap. Now, this war was very unpopular in the North while it was going on. And they nicknamed it Polk's War, because they thought that he was the only reason this war was taking place in the first place. This pro-slavery Southern president wants to have this war specifically to get all this extra land in order to spread the institution of slavery further west and to pick up more pro-slavery senators to put in the Capitol building in Washington. So with that in mind, there is a member of the House of Representatives representing the state of Pennsylvania, a northern state. His name is David Wilmot, and he proposed what we now call the Wilmot Proviso in 1846. And that proposed that all land acquired from Mexico as a result of this war would be barred from slavery. That none of this territory could become slave states. And it was shot down. So it did not succeed. But it scared a lot of Southerners. It angered a lot of Southerners that Northerners are getting increasingly hostile towards the institution of slavery. Now, you have to understand that the South has some very hard feelings about this territory which had been won by for winning this war. So what we need to point out is the fact that they were very much the idea that the vast majority of soldiers who fought in the Mexican War were from the South, and most of the officers who fought in the war were Southerners. Therefore, the South was the region that put their blood on the line to get all this land, and therefore the South should be able to claim this new land as theirs, meaning open to slavery. And that was a belief that Southern senators, etc., were very, very open about, and they made no apology for it. So Northerners, yes, they know that a huge chunk of this land is going to be south of the 3630 parallel. Remember, that's the Missouri Compromise line. And we mentioned that a Southern president is the one who took all of this territory. Now, there was some real concern that, yes, this newly acquired territory is going to become a slave territory. To appease the Northerners, Washington did negotiate a purchase of what was then called the Oregon Territory, which was jointly managed by both the United States and the British up to that point. So they acquired that territory to appease the Northerners, thinking, okay, yeah, new territory is entering the United States that is largely in the South, but we're also bringing in territory in the North, which would obviously become free states. So that was done largely to appease the Northern politicians. Okay, now 1848, we have another election, and the candidate is Zachary Taylor, who was born in Virginia. He is a Whig, and he won that election, and with that in mind, what's going to happen is he is going to declare that California and New Mexico should apply for statehood immediately, now. Don't wait. Don't wait till a certain number of people get out there. Apply for statehood now. And if they apply for statehood now, we won't have all the buildup of the tension that would happen if we set a date in the long term. And we won't have the huge arguments in Congress. But Southerners didn't like the fact that actually at that point, 1849, the vast majority of people who were living in California who were not Native Americans, so those who were American citizens, were not slave owners. Therefore, these new states would come in most likely as free states. Southerners were absolutely furious. And now I want to talk about James Hammond. Well, at this point was not an active politician, but he was still very, very vocal. He had served as both a member of the House of Representatives and as governor of the state of South Carolina, where he's from, and he's a Southern Democrat. And he said, if Taylor gets his wish, we should kick the Northerners out of the Capitol and set it on fire. John C. Calhoun's a little bit more eloquent in his speech, said, if this scheme excluding slavery from California and New Mexico should be carried out, if we are to be reduced to a mere handful, then I say, woe, woe upon this union. So you can see the anger that Southerners are expressing towards this Southern-born president. And this is going to basically make the Whig Party no longer seen as a viable option for many Southerners. And when we get to 1850, we're going to have to finally start talking about, what are we going to do with all this territory that the United States acquired as a result of the victory against Mexico. And so we got California to deal with. Are they going to be a free state, a slave state? Should we cut them up, cut them in half? Northern California, Southern California. If you did extend the Missouri Compromise line, the 3630 parallel, out to the Pacific, it would go right smack across the middle of California. So there were some people who said that you should split California in two. Northern California, Southern California. Okay, Northern senators and congressmen in particular were against that idea. They wanted California to come in as one single free state. Now, there's also New Mexico and Utah. Those are other territories also acquired from Mexico. And, well, what do we do about them? Are they going to be open to slavery? So these are all issues that we're going to have to talk about, and this is going to be settled by the so-called Compromise of 1850. Please note the question mark I've got after compromise, an indication that this is not going to be anything like what we saw in 1820 when Missouri tried to enter the Union. And so to create the Compromise of 1850, it will actually be brokered by Henry Clay. And you'll remember him from the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which he very much helped achieve. Now, this 30 years later, Henry Clay, therefore, is 30 years older and frailer, and he walked in there with a cane, and although he is a lot weaker than he was and older, etc., he still has a very firm mind, and he has some proposals which hopefully should break up this fight between Northern and Southern politicians in regards to what in the world to do with California and these other new territories, and to reach a compromise so both parties will be satisfied. So he proposes California would be admitted to the Union as a single state, and it would be a free state. Slavery would not be allowed. He also proposed abolishing the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now that was interesting because, well, obviously it's going to anger the Southern politicians. But remember that Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, is actually carved out of the state of Maryland. Maryland is a slave state. Washington, D.C. was a slave city, a slave district, if you wish to put it that way. And so there were slaves in Washington, house slaves, obviously, for the most part. But we're not going to abolish slavery in the city, just the trade of slaves. So you're not be able to sell slaves anymore. There'll be no more slave markets in Washington, D.C. But no slave that already resides in Washington is going to be liberated as a result of the Compromise of 1850 if it is approved. So Clay also proposed creating a new fugitive slave law. This will come in the name of the Fugitive Slave Act. And prior to this, that slaves could escape to northern states, free states, and declare freedom. And with that, masters in the South couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't do anything to get them back, or very little. But with a fugitive slave law, it would be different. And they're going to mandate with this new law that it was the duty of all American citizens in the North and Northern sheriffs to find, to report, and apprehend any runaway slave that they encounter. It was therefore going to be made illegal for you to not say anything if you know that slaves are hiding in a barn on your property. It would be illegal for a sheriff to not report runaway slaves and to not apprehend them, and to then make efforts to return that slave to that master. Okay, now more than that, it means that slaves will have to make it all the way to Canada in order to achieve freedom. It was no longer going to be good enough to get just to the northern states should this compromise measure be approved. And well, what do we do with the territories of New Mexico and Utah? Clay proposed kicking that can down the road. Again, he is a politician. Politicians do like to kick the can down the road, and here we go again. So that one he's proposed, we'll deal with it later. All four of these measures are approved, unsurprisingly. North is satisfied for the most part. They don't like the Fugitive Slave Act at all. And in fact, abolitionists openly are going to say, well, we're not going to abide by that. It goes against our principles. Northern politicians said that Northerners should not abide by it, and even sheriffs a lot of times refuse to cooperate with it. So to the South, at first it sounded good, but they very quickly learned that Northerners were not going to play ball with that at all. So that ended up actually making it closer to war. But California entering the Union as a free state. Now, prior to California's entry to the Union, there was an exactly equal number of free states and slave states. Now, there is one more free state. That means there are two more anti-slavery senators in Washington than there are pro-slavery senators. This balance is going to be permanent. And with this in mind, that means that Congress is forever going to be dominated by Northern politicians. It will never have an equality between Northern and Southern politicians in the Senate. And therefore, slavery was closer to being eradicated in the United States if the South doesn't play its cards very carefully. So the South overall is not pleased with the Compromise of 1850, and they didn't really see it as a compromise. If it was a compromise, they thought California should have been split in two, but that didn't happen. So the South did not see this as a compromise. For the North, they saw themselves getting the upper end of the stick on this one, and it's absolutely true, they did. 1852, just 2 years later, slight change of topic, we're now going to move over to literature. Okay, so Harriet Beecher Stowe was a woman in New England who wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is fiction. It is a very tragic story about a slave and his experience in his life, who experiences family members being sold off, and the character is eventually beaten to death towards the end of it by his evil slave master, Simon Legree. The book was very popular in New England when it first came out, as well as in some other areas of the North, but not quite as much. But the first edition sold out very quickly. And it caused the abolitionist movement to grow. It also angered a lot of Southerners, and Southerners did point out the fact that actually prior to writing this book, Harriet Beecher Stowe had never actually visited the South. So she had never seen slavery firsthand, yet she'd written a very vivid novel about it. So Southerners were very quick to question how authoritative she was on the subject. But it doesn't matter. She wrote the book. It was very well received in the North, and it created a much greater abolitionist movement. And that is why the book is significant. It's so significant that midway through the American Civil War, she will visit Abraham Lincoln in the White House. And Abraham Lincoln, when he greets her, he'll say, "Oh, so you're that little old lady who started this bloody war." So there's no question about it. Harriet Beecher Stowe played a huge role in the American Civil War breaking out. You cannot argue against that. All right, now 2 years later, we still got to figure out about what to do about not just this land acquired from Mexico, in addition to the New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory, but we've also got to figure out an area that had been referred to as the unorganized territory, which is north of the Missouri Compromise line. And of course, that should therefore all come in as free states without any dispute whatsoever. However, you had a senator, Stephen A. Douglas, senator from Illinois, who decides he has this new idea that would forever solve the dispute over slavery, and saying, let's take the argument, let's get it out of the Capitol building, let's get it out of the chamber of the United States Senate, out of the House of Representatives, and let's put it in the hands of the American people themselves. Let's not have the politicians decide the future of slavery. Let's let the American people decide it for themselves. And he came with this idea called popular sovereignty. And what this meant was, if approved, any new state entering the Union would get to decide for themselves whether or not to have slavery. So what do you have to do in order to have this sort of popular sovereignty take place? You'll have to have a date set for a referendum within that new state. And the people who are there will vote for it to be a free state or a slave state. Simply put, power to the people. Of course, a quote that we think about from the 1960s, but that is in a way what Stephen Douglas had in mind as well, for a very, very different reason than what you saw in the 1960s. Now, he proposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 because you have the Kansas Territory, which is very close to applying for statehood, and that will be followed most likely by a future state of Nebraska, just north of it. So what are we going to do about these states at which, well, he says they would be coming in as free states, but why don't we let the people themselves decide, not us politicians? The Kansas-Nebraska Act was narrowly approved by Congress. And that's important to understand because that means now areas north of the Missouri Compromise line could technically be slave states. Now let's see what happened. Yeah, well, it caused a bloodbath in Kansas. So 1856 is when Kansas is applying for statehood, and they want to decide whether or not to enter as a slave state or as a free state. Now, there was established a town called Lawrence, which was called the capital of free Kansas. And so you had actually a lot of abolitionists who did move out to Kansas on purpose, just so they could be there to vote against the new state being a slave state. Likewise, you had a lot of pro-slavery ruffians who came up from Texas, from Arkansas, from Mississippi, Louisiana, and other places, who also are coming there to be there just so they can also vote. And of course, they want to vote for Kansas to be a slave state. Now let's look at what happened. So the Lawrence raid, that was when the pro-slavery advocates attacked the town and burned parts of it down. A number of people were killed when the town was ransacked. So it was an absolute mess. There was 800 pro-slavery ruffians who did cross into Kansas in order to do this. So they also managed to burn down the home of the so-called Free Soil governor of Kansas. Now, Pottawatomie Creek, was in retaliation for the Lawrence raid. And the guy who led this attack was a man named John Brown. John Brown was perhaps the most ardent anti-slavery advocate, the most hardcore abolitionist. And he had walked into a church in New England, and he made an oath to God that he would dedicate his life towards eradicating America of the institution of slavery. So in his mind, he is on a mission from God to do exactly that. Now, John Brown and his sons sneaked to Pottawatomie Creek one night in 1856. Why Pottawatomie Creek? Because there was actually a campsite there, and some cabins had been set up by pro-slavery advocates. Now, snuck there at nighttime, and they broke into the cabins and pulled some of the men out of the cabin, and they cut their throats and shot them right in front of their own wives and children. And that happened to five slave owners in that incident. Again, that terrified white Southerners. Again, it was another example of North and South of white people killing white people over the institution of slavery, which we've seen in Lawrence. Now we're seeing it again here at Pottawatomie Creek. And it seems that America is becoming more violent as far as its debate over the institution of slavery is concerned. But with Bleeding Kansas, you had a total death rate of 200. So that is significant and very important to point out. But something else to understand about Bleeding Kansas is it did not solve the problem of Kansas. It didn't answer the question of whether Kansas would enter as a slave or a free state. And so, but it did create a lot of bloodshed. It was a foreshadow, very much so, of what was to come. A sneak preview, if you will, a trailer of the upcoming Civil War. Now, as the debate moves right back onto Capitol Hill, you have a problem where in the Senator, there's a very hardcore abolitionist senator named Charles Sumner, who's from Massachusetts. And during a debate about slavery, Charles Sumner attacked personally a pro-slavery senator from South Carolina named Andrew Butler. And Andrew Butler actually had co-authored the Kansas-Nebraska Act with Stephen Douglas. And in his attack on Andrew Butler, Charles Sumner said to him that this was another example of the South trying to spread slavery, and that slave masters love slavery not just for economic reasons, but also because of the sexual relationships that they could get for free out of the slaves themselves. And the response to that within the chamber was a huge volume of screams from Southern senators who were outraged, felt disrespected, felt that their region, the South, had been disrespected, that their culture had been disrespected. And how dare he say something like this so publicly in the United States Senate chamber? Well, nothing more happened there. But Butler had a cousin, Preston Brooks, who was not a senator, but he was a member of the House of Representatives, also representing the state of South Carolina. And so Preston Brooks was absolutely furious about this incident. And he's like, well, I've got to do something about this. And he decided that he was going to challenge Charles Sumner to a duel. But some of the other South Carolina representatives said to Preston Brooks, especially Lawrence Kite, said, you can't challenge Charles Sumner to a duel because that goes against dueling etiquette, because you only can challenge another gentleman to a duel. You can't challenge just anybody. You have to challenge a gentleman. Charles Sumner's not a gentleman. So if you challenge him to a duel, you are asserting that he is your equal. And so with that, Preston Brooks goes, okay, well, so I'm not going to challenge him to a duel, so I'm just going to go and beat the hell out of him. So, and that's exactly what he did. He did what he's not supposed to do, Members of the House of Representatives are not supposed to enter the Senate, but he does, and he is flanked by 2 other members of the House of Representatives who go in there with him. And there's mixed reports on what exactly President Brooks said to Sumner before he attacked them, but they're somewhere along the lines of, "You son of a bitch, you have disrespected my family, you have disrespected the state of South Carolina," and he then attacked him with the cane, beating him over the head with it. And that was something that we'd never seen before in anywhere in Congress, House or Senate. And he didn't stop when Charles Sumner climbed underneath the desk. He just knocked the desk over. And then he didn't even stop when the cane broke over his head. And eventually he was pulled back by some other senators, and he did then walk out of the chamber. Sumner was almost killed in the incident, and he got a very bad head injury, and he never fully recovered from it. And one of the results of that was Sumner became even more anti-slavery, and even more so looking for a fight. And Preston Brooks, well, he ended up having huge numbers of parcels sent to his office in Washington, to the point his door was almost barricaded by these huge boxes. And all these boxes were full of canes that people had sent from all over the South for him. They were made of the nicest wood. Some of them were actually, well, at least one of them was actually made of metal material. Some of the canes were engraved with slogans like "Hit the son of a bitch again." So to the South, Preston Brooks was a hero. To the North, Charles Sumner was the hero. So again, you see this sectional tension is getting worse and worse. It's getting so violent, you're even having fights breaking out on Capitol Hill in Washington. And there you are. You can see an illustration of the attack that Preston Brooks made on Charles Sumner. The election of 1856 was a very historic election, and a lot to do with the lineup, who's who in this presidential election. James Buchanan is the Democratic nominee, and John C. Fremont is the nominee of the other political party in this election. Now, this other political party, the Republican Party, they're new, created in 1854, so just 2 years earlier. And they are made up of people who had been in the Whig Party. The Whig Party is now no more. They also have in their membership people who had been members of the shortly lived Free Soil Party, Free Soil, anti-slavery. And they also took some Northern Democrats with them. So this new political party, the Republican Party, is a Northern party exclusively. They also are very much a party centered around stopping the spread of slavery into new territory. That means eventually slavery will die out. This is a big deal. Now, the fact also is the fact that John C. Fremont is an abolitionist himself. The South knows that. They know that he's a threat if he wins. James Buchanan does win the election, so the South took a huge sigh of relief when that happened. But they were still absolutely paranoid anyway, because if you think about it, what political party stays in power forever? If we keep this two-party system of Democrats and Republicans, eventually there's going to be a Republican president. As we mentioned with the Compromise of 1850, California entered the Union as a free state, and that meant we had 2 more anti-slavery senators than pro-slavery senators in the Senate. Therefore, the Congress now is dominated in both chambers, the House and the Senate, by Northern politicians, by those who are anti-slavery. They could pass a bill which would abolish slavery if the president is willing to sign it. Now, a Democratic president, if it lands on his desk after passing Congress, could easily get vetoed. But what if it arrives on the desk of a Republican president in the future? And so that Republican president very well might sign it into law. And with that, slavery is no more. And that the South was not going to put up with. So at this point, 1856, yes, a Democrat wins, defeats the Republican candidate, but the fact of the matter is the Republican Party is now in the picture. Eventually, they're going to win the White House. And the South is thinking, well, we need to do something about that. And for them, a lot of them, that means we need to get out of this American Union before the North takes away our slaves. And there's no question about it. That is why they are eventually going to secede. But they start thinking about it here. 1857, so just 1 year later, you have the single most controversial Supreme Court decision in American history. Very interesting. Now, Dred Scott was a slave. He was a slave who was from Missouri, and at some point, his master took him and his wife into a free state. Owing to that, Dred Scott argued that because he was taken to a state that does not recognize the institution of slavery, therefore he is recognized as a free man. And he sued for his freedom. This case ended up in the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And the court ruled 7-2 against Dred Scott. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, the guy on the bottom right, he's the one who's going to deliver the verdict. And his verdict is that blacks in America are not citizens, and therefore they cannot sue anyone in any court of law in the United States. They do not have that privilege. That privilege is reserved to American citizens. Also, the Constitution of the United States protects property of American citizens. You cannot take away someone's property without due cause. Slaves, according to Taney, are property. Therefore, as property, slave owners can take them anywhere, and they retain them as their property. With that in mind, he went further to say the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. And this whole business of the 3630 parallel Missouri Compromise line, you could take slaves north of that, no problem. You can make them do whatever you want because they're your property. No state law can trump a federal law protecting a citizen's rights to maintain his or her private property. And therefore, that technically means there's no such thing as a free state. There are only slave states. Well, the South was overjoyed by this decision. They were in the most celebratory mood you can imagine. And they thought, finally, the federal government does something in our favor. Conversely, Northern politicians were absolutely furious by this decision. And Northern states, led by Northern governors, were just absolutely just vindictive in their response to the Dred Scott decision. And is that really surprising at all? No, not really. And this is going to take us, again, another step closer to the American Civil War, because it's going to just strengthen the level of anger, the sectionalist tensions between North and South, and the hatred that they feel towards each other. As we get closer and closer to 1860, the more and more anger that keeps on just brewing and brewing and brewing. Now, this is what Taney said, what he read aloud in the court. Black people are not included, and were not included to be under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. So I think it goes without saying as to why this is viewed by historians today, and most American people today, as the most controversial and worst decision the Supreme Court has ever reached. And that is why, a few years ago, the two statues of Roger B. Taney, which were in the state of Maryland, were both pulled up. And with that, he is no longer viewed as a hero in the state of Maryland, nor anywhere in the United States. So that is the end of Lecture 3 for the American Civil War series. Please make sure that you like my lecture if you did like it, and please also subscribe and pass on this lecture to anyone you think might enjoy or benefit from it. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.